Welcome back to session 5 of the SLO process. In this session, you will complete section 3 of the template, Performance Measures. As we previously discussed, performance measures are the assessments your students will take in order to determine if they meet the goal that you've set. For this session, you will need a few tools. Let's gather them now. First, you will need the template. Notice section 3 of the template has a space for multiple performance measures. You will also need the Google Doc form that you will submit your SLO. Here is the Google Doc form. In this case, the performance measures are listed in order of performance measure 1, and all of the components you need to complete for that one are in one section. Then you will see an opportunity to complete performance measure 2 with all of the components, and performance measure 3 with all of the components. Find the help desk, section 3, where you will again see each of the components, their definitions, the format or the way in which you will report those components, and an example of how those might look. You will also need 2 new frameworks and organizers. The first is the Performance Task Framework, pictured here. And the next is the Performance Task Organizer. It's the equivalent of the help desk for writing performance measures. Again, in this one, you will notice the name of the element, the definition, and the example, much like the other help desk that you were using. By going back to the directions sheet, you can also access these templates by clicking on the hyperlinks noted here. So let's start looking at what kind of assessments we will use to help learn if our students meet the goal that we have set. Many things must be considered when building quality assessments. For the purpose of your SLO goal, we're asking you have 3 assessments. Each assessment, you must consider, what does a teacher do to administer a performance measure? What does a student know and do to complete a performance measure? And then how does the teacher score the performance measure? In your template, you will complete the name of the measures and the type of assessment, in addition to 8 other components. For each performance measure, it will be helpful to complete the performance task framework. First, identify the name of the test or assessment. Next, you are going to make sure that that assessment is aligned to the standards that you want to measure. Then you will talk about, with your group, who's going to administer the assessment. And then what do students need to know in order to be able to complete the assessment? Finally, in your teams, you will talk about how will you score and report the outcomes of the assessment. Completing this framework will be helpful for when you actually go to the template to complete the 3rd section, the performance task or the performance measure assessments. So there are some guidelines on the 2nd page of the framework that will help you as you talk about this in your teams. As you work your way through this for each of your performance measures, be sure to refer to the help desk, which gives additional definitions and format examples. In this view, you will see side by side the form you need to complete along with what goes in each form. For example, in Section A, the name of the performance measure, provide a brief title of the first assessment you will use to know if your students achieved your goal. On the Google form, the assessment goes here. So perhaps it's a writing task for arguments. Section B, using the drop-down menu, what is the type of assessment that we just identified? So I'll click on that, and I see that I'm going to use a PV assessment. That's one that we create in-house. A nationally recognized standard test is a possibility. Industry certification examinations are possible. Student project, you can determine when that would be appropriate, a portfolio or other. But typically, you'll use the PV assessment unless you might be using an everyday math assessment. Okay, you can put that in there as an other. So we'll leave it as a PV assessment for example purposes. Now the purpose or performance of this measure is next. So you're going to write just a very brief narrative explaining the reasonings that you're going to use this assessment. How does this assessment measure student growth? So in this, I want to measure who, what, and why. So I will say 5th graders will respond to an article by writing an argument supporting one side or the other of an issue. Next, is the metric. This is important. Are you considering growth, which would be a change in performance across 2 points in time, mastery, a minimum level of achievement, or both? I'm going to select both because I'm going to want my students to achieve at least a 3 on the writing rubric, but also improve from a pre-assessment that I administer in the fall. How often will this performance measure be given? 3 times a year. First is a pre-assessment. Later in trimester 1 and 2. At that point, I can repeat those sections for performance measures 2 and 3. Again, we're asking that each teacher identify 3 performance measures. You can identify more. You can administer one multiple times. But by identifying 3, it gives you the best chance of attaining the goal that you set for children, as opposed to 1 or 2. This would be a good time to stop the video and consider which assessments you will use and why. Be sure to complete the framework if you think that will be helpful, and then work with your teams to identify which assessments can best be served, helping you learn whether or not students have achieved your goal. When you're finished with that part, resume the video to complete the rest of the section. Now we're going to complete section 3. In the event that you are teaching classes with students with IEPs, English language learners, students with GIEPs, students perhaps with a 504 plan that requires special accommodations, you might note that here. If you are unable to answer that question at this time because you haven't seen your roster, that's perfectly fine. You can revisit this in the fall. If you do identify that you will have students with English language needs. You would check off a box, and then you would be explicit in how those students would have a differential scoring model or different assessment altogether. Be explicit in what you might do. So in a writing task, we might permit a word-to-word translator. For example. Moving on in this section, list any resources or equipment you might need in order to properly administer the assessment. Might be something different in a phys ed class or a family and consumer science class or a technology class. Whatever it is that will be unique to your assessment that your students will need in order to take the assessment, you would indicate here. So in the case of a writing assessment, we might need access to Google Drive for ease of teacher scoring, for example. Then moving on to section 3H, the scoring tools. What ways will you score each of the performance measures? If I'm giving 3 writing assessments, I will probably use a rubric, and it might be the PDE model. It might be the PVSD model. You might use a bubble sheet with a Scantron. Whatever it is that you think you're going to need to do. If you need to create rubrics, you'll do that in the next day's the assessment training round. Section 3I, administration and scoring personnel. Who will be actually giving the assessment and who will be scoring the assessment? Please identify those people in this box. And finally, in performance reporting, how will you communicate these scores to others? To your principal, to your staff members, to your parents, to students. Okay, how will you communicate the scores to others? You might keep a gradebook that's shared through eSchool with parents, for example. Take time now to finish up section 3. An important point to remember is in many cases you will work on the specific components of section 3 in tomorrow's in-service. This is where you want to go back and revisit each of the assessments that you've identified and determine the who, what, when, where, and how each of these assessments will be administered, as well as their alignment to the standards, as well as their alignment to PVSD goals, and making sure that these assessments are more common than not. If you have questions, please see your principal or your department chair. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video where we complete section 4.